There's this huge lack of data around MMIW, whether it's the rates at which we're going missing and murdered. Nobody really knows that number. But a lot of the data that is being collected is being done by Indigenous women at a grassroots level. So I think that's pretty amazing. But like you said, the data is important to be represented in that data because it moves resources. It pushes policy, it pushes money, it pushes funding. So we could actually get the resources to respond to this epidemic correctly and properly in a trauma-informed, family-centered, cultural way. But we could also push money to eliminate the violence from happening in the first place, to put these protections in place so we don't go missing and murdered. We're not as vulnerable. So I think there was like UIHI, SBI have done a lot of really amazing work and put out some reports that kind of connect these dots, like the historical dots, the present dots, where are we going missing and murdered, but they also make it something that we can relate to. Like we're human beings again. They tell it with a story. It's not just like numbers. And I think part of that too, the data, and when it's collected in a culturally informed way, we do use storytelling to share out that data, and it's impactful and it's powerful. But I think it also eliminates some of these bias and stereotypes around like how we're going missing and murdered and why we're going missing murdered and where we are going missing and murdered.
Right. And I think that to Kristin's point, and a lot of there's lots of reasons why there's a void in the data, and some of it is intentional, and some of it is not. You know, in many areas we make up like 1% of the population, right? And so there's a disconnect, I feel, at large, and I think that's why it's so important that we do have partnerships and allies like this and education like this. But Kristin's absolutely right. The majority of Indigenous people live in urban areas. So, you know, it's always like MMIW is always a problem over there. But really, it's all of our problem, right? And so on the reservation level, you know, many of those communities or tribal communities are dealing with, you know, racism and in their justice systems or in law enforcement, right? Where in the urban areas, there's like many times there's a disconnect, as you're saying, Marianne, right? And even in my own, when I think about my mother, she was stolen as a child and then entered into the foster care system, and they had her labeled as Spanish. I mean, forever. So, you know, if something had happened to her, there would have been no way to know that this was an Indigenous woman.
I think resources, you know, there's recognition like our tribal PDs and smaller rural areas don't have the same resources to have these bigger databases or to have the training, right? So I think that's a part of it too. Like we need to understand, like you said, part of it is intentional, part of it is just lack of resources available to those areas, lack of training for our area, like tribal and rural areas.
And so to speak to that is, so historically I came into policing in 1991, and at that point when we were documenting the race of who we were dealing with, it was white or black. And only about midway through my career did Pacific Islander, Native American, and other more informed categories, if you will, were added to those lists. So if you look at the data of all of before that, it was if you weren't in this box or in this box, you got put in one box or the other. And that's how you were counted. And again, if you look at NamUs and how many unidentified human remains are out there sitting in coroner's offices, those remains are they'll never be identified because of that initial data issue. They weren't reported. Sometimes when it comes down to bones and if forensic anthropologists get involved, then race and status of in a certain group of people because of things that were eaten by the people, things about those bones, stories that those bones tell about who they actually belong to can help So you can identify the remains, but then trying to link it to a missing person who's listed as a white female, or perhaps an African American female, those two are never going to add up.